Good morning, boys and girls. We're on to chapter 12 of Shooting the Moon, where we left off last. Chapter 11 was kind of one of those reflective uh, chapters. She was babysitting Cindy, and she was kind of, thinking about old times with her brother and things like that. Anyway, we're on to chapter 12. All right, here we go. When TJ had come home for a few days after basic training, he looked like a completely different person. He looked like a soldier. I was almost scared to talk to him because I could tell he was a changed person. And I knew that whatever he'd gone through in basic training had made him stronger and harder, more ready for war. Made me feel like a little kid just to stand beside him. I figured that's what I was compared to him. That I was compared what I was compared to him, a kid. And I figured that when he got back from Vietnam, it would be like there were 20 years between us instead of just 5. And we might not have anything to say. We'd be just so different from each other. When he got back, he would have been in a real war. Probably the closest TJ and I have ever been was when he was 12 and I was 7. I was old enough and smart enough by then to do stuff with him, and he was still enough of a kid that he could include a 7-year-old in his plans. Those were our best war days, when we kept notebooks of make believe battles and ran home from General MacArthur Elementary School, where TJ was in 6th grade and I was in second, so we can get up our army guys and test out our strategies against the enemy, which was commanded by Bobby Kerner and his little brother Charles. In a way, it's like we'd been soldiers together. I wondered if he still remembered how that felt. One thing I knew for sure when I saw him after basic training was that he'd forget the old days soon enough, if he hadn't already. He was headed for a real combat zone. I've been assigned to the 51st Medical Company base in Fubai, he reported at the dinner table. We ship out next Thursday. My mother paled. That soon? From what they're telling us, they need all the help they can get over there, as fast as they can get it. Then TJ leaned back in his chair and looked at the colonel. Sir, he said, I needed to do something for me. All this time, the colonel had been listening, but not saying anything. Now he folded his arms across his chest and said, What do you need me to do, son? I need you to act like you're proud of me. The colonel looked like TJ had punched him in the gut. It was the most outright look of surprise I'd ever seen on his face. It took him a minute to gather himself enough to say, Of course I'm proud of you, TJ. You just think I'm making a mistake. We're past all that, son, the colonel said, sounding sure of himself now. I'm with you 100%. I'm just trying to get used to the idea of you being a soldier. I'll tell you what, you sure look like one. You remind me of myself in my prime. Son, you're going to have to beat the women off with a stick. The colonel shook his head. Asking me if I'm proud of you? How could I not be proud of you, TJ? TJ looked down at the table, but I could tell he was smiling. Like that's all he needed the colonel to say to him. After that, everything broke loose, especially the colonel's tongue. The man could talk some talk, and that night we got an earful. Someone had turned the opera back on. Now, you want to talk about a man who looked good in his first uniform, the colonel said, leaning back until his chair tipped. Woo-hoo. He turned to my mother. Tell these children, Jeannie Pooh, what a handsome rascal I was when you first met me. When my mother just shook her head and laughed, he turned back to me and TJ. Oh, she's too embarrassed. You never saw a woman throw herself at a man the way your mother threw herself at me, let me tell you now. Oh, Tom, my mother said, blushing, even though this was approximately the 8,000th time the colonel had told us the story about the dance where he and my mother had met. I don't think exactly that's what happened, dear. The colonel winked. Don't buy this little modest act of hers. She was brazen that night. Shameless might be the better word for it. I slipped into the colonel's story like it was a comfortable pair of old sneakers. I could have told the whole thing word for word, acted out all the colonel's winks and asides. I knew it so well. I glanced at TJ, who was grinning like a kid, suddenly not looking so combat ready. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. It was good to have the old colonel back. We went out to the backyard after dinner to toss around the football. Even my mother, who not only had an amazing wealth of knowledge about the Washington Redskins, the colonel's A1, number one football team, but was also a fairly accomplished wide receiver. All right, everybody go for a long pass, the colonel commanded, and the rest of us ran toward an imaginary end zone, across the heat blasted grass, past the tomatoes and the black eyed Susans. The colonel lobbed one at my mother, woo, but it flew overhead and went bouncing off into the grass. TJ scooped it up and spiraled it back to the colonel, who shot it at me. I pulled that baby out of the air and made a beeline for the line of roses the colonel had planted at the end of the edge of our yard. They were big, showy flowers. The babies of the garden threatened to fall down and die if you didn't bow to their every whim. I squinted my eyes and pretended they were the opposing team's defensive line, veering left, then right, and dove through a gap in the middle. "That's my girl," the colonel yelled from the other end of the yard. "You show me there, Jamie Dexter, and I'll show you a girl who can play some football." I rolled onto my back and smiled up at the sky. At that very minute, everything was right with my world. But TJ was only home for the weekend. On Monday, we drove him to the airport to put him on the plane for California. In California, he'd board an Army transport for Vietnam. It was finally happening. I walked next to TJ through the airport, proud to be seen with him in his combat fatigues and polished up boots, an olive green duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My mother, of course, started to cry when we reached TJ's gate. But she tried to act like she wasn't. She stood up straight and pretended to brush something off of TJ's shoulder. "You be sure to eat now, TJ," she said before a half sob got caught in her throat. I don't I don't want you getting too thin now." TJ kissed her on the cheek. "I will, Mom. I'll eat everything they put in front of me. I promise now." The colonel shook TJ's hand. "No heroics, son. Just do your job. Make us proud." "Yes, sir." I didn't know what to do. We weren't a family of huggers, but I felt stupid just standing there. Finally, I stuck out my hand and TJ took it. We shook solemnly. "Write me letters," I told him. "I want to know everything that happens to you." TJ leaned over and ruffled my hair. "I'll keep in touch," he promised. He started for the gate. I ran after him. "Hey, TJ," I yelled. "Pathfinders!" TJ turned around and saluted. "Combat ready!" And then he walked through the gateway and disappeared. Once TJ was out of sight, the colonel sighed and shook his head. The only way out is through," he said to no one in particular. "The only way out of what, Tom?" my mother asked him. "The whole damn thing," the colonel began, walking toward the car. My mother and I trailed behind him. I, for one, didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't much care. I was wound up tighter than a German clock. TJ was going to Vietnam. My brother was going to war, just like we'd always dreamed of. All right, now we'll bring us to chapter 13. So that was a little bit of a flashback chapter, just kind of talking about when he came back after his 6 weeks of basic training. So, anyway, on to chapter 13 next. All right, have a great day.